In the depths of biblical history, we find a figure whose words echo through the centuries, touching hearts and challenging minds to this day. We are talking about Isaiah, one of the greatest prophets of the Old Testament, whose book is a treasure of divine revelations and extraordinary visions. But what makes Isaiah's prophecies so special? Why, even after millennia, do his words continue to captivate readers and scholars around the world? Imagine yourself transported to Jerusalem over 2,700 years ago. The streets are filled with people. The temple is the center of religious life. And in the midst of this scene, a man arises with a message that will shake the foundations of the nation. This man is Isaiah, and his prophecies are not mere predictions of the future. They are a glimpse into the very heart of God. The book of Isaiah is like a roadmap of destiny, not only for Israel but for all humanity. It is a text that challenges our understanding, mixing dark warnings with radiant promises of hope. To give you an idea, it's as if Isaiah had access to a divine script, revealing scene by scene the cosmic drama that would unfold in the centuries to come. But don't think that Isaiah was a distant man lost in heavenly visions. No, my dear, he was deeply engaged with his people and his time. Isaiah saw the corruption of leaders, social injustice, religious hypocrisy, and he did not remain silent. His words were like thunder, warning of the divine judgment that would come if the people did not repent. And here is the first lesson we can learn from Isaiah: the importance of having the courage to speak the truth, even when it is inconvenient. How many times have we remained silent in the face of injustices out of fear of confrontation? Isaiah teaches us that the truth, no matter how hard it is the path to redemption. But Isaiah's prophecies are not just about judgment. Oh no, they are a beacon of hope in the midst of darkness. Isaiah speaks of a future where wolves and lambs will live in peace, where swords will be turned into plowshares. Does it sound utopian? Perhaps. But what if these visions are an invitation to dream of a better world and work to make it a reality? One of the most fascinating things about the book of Isaiah is how it intertwines the present, the near future, and a distant future. It's as if he were watching a movie in multiple temporal dimensions at once. He speaks of kings and kingdoms of his time, but also of a Messiah who would come centuries later, and of an eternal kingdom that is still to come. Think about that for a moment. What would it be like to have this panoramic view of history? How would it change our perspective on the challenges of everyday life? Perhaps, like Isaiah, we would learn to see beyond immediate circumstances and trust in a greater plan. And speaking of a greater plan, we cannot overlook Isaiah's messianic prophecies. They are so precise, so detailed, that many call them the fifth gospel. Isaiah speaks of a suffering servant, a king born of a virgin, a ruler who will bring everlasting peace. For Christians, these prophecies find their fulfillment in Jesus Christ. But even if you are not a Christian, there is something deeply intriguing about these prophecies. They make us question, is there a greater purpose for human history? Are we moving toward some kind of cosmic climax? What makes the book of Isaiah so captivating is that it is not just a religious text. It is a literary work of immense beauty and power. Isaiah's language is rich in metaphors and vivid imagery. He speaks of mountains melting like wax, of deserts blooming like roses. It is poetry in its highest form. And here is another lesson we can learn from Isaiah: the importance of language and communication. In a world saturated with information, how can we convey messages that truly touch people? Perhaps we need to rediscover the power of poetic language, of metaphors that spark the imagination. But don't be fooled into thinking that Isaiah was just a dreamy poet. His prophecies are anchored in the concrete reality of his time. He names kings, speaks of political alliances, comments on the economic situation. It is a reminder that authentic spirituality does not distance us from the world. It engages us more deeply with it. This leads us to a crucial question: how do we balance our spiritual vision with our involvement in the world? Isaiah shows us that it is possible and necessary to have our feet on the ground and our eyes on the sky. Isaiah's divine calling is a pivotal event in the history of biblical prophecy. This landmark moment in the prophet's life occurred in the Temple of Jerusalem, a place of great religious significance for the people of Israel. Isaiah's experience, described in chapter 6 of his book, is a powerful narrative that illustrates the encounter between the divine and the human. In the year of King Uzziah's death, Isaiah had an extraordinary vision. He saw the Lord sitting on a high and exalted throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. This striking image conveys the greatness and majesty of God. It is important to note that this vision occurred at a time of political transition, highlighting how prophetic calling often coincides with periods of change and uncertainty. The description Isaiah gives of the scene is rich in symbolic details. He mentions seraphim, celestial beings who flew above the throne. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. This image conveys a sense of reverence and continuous worship in the divine presence. The seraphim proclaimed, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, the whole earth is full of his glory." Isaiah's reaction to this vision is profoundly human and touching. In the face of God's holiness, he feels completely inadequate. He exclaims, "Woe to me, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips and live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." This confession from Isaiah reflects a recurring theme in prophetic experiences, the recognition of one's own unworthiness before divine perfection. What follows is a symbolic act of purification. One of the seraphim flies to Isaiah with a live coal, which he had taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touches Isaiah's lips with the coal and declares, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is removed, and your sin is forgiven." This act represents the necessary purification and preparation for prophetic service. After this symbolic purification, Isaiah hears the voice of the Lord asking, "Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?" Isaiah's response is immediate and decisive. "Here I am, send me." This response demonstrates Isaiah's willingness to accept the divine call, even without fully knowing what it would entail. Isaiah's calling is not for an easy task. The Lord sends him to deliver a difficult message to the people. He must warn them about the consequences of their disobedience and lack of faith. The message that Isaiah must convey is challenging. The people will hear, but will not understand. They will see, but will not perceive. This part of Isaiah's calling illustrates a common reality in prophetic ministry, the task of delivering unpopular messages and facing the people's resistance. It is important to contextualize Isaiah's calling within the historical situation of Israel at that time. The kingdom was divided, with Israel to the north and Judah to the south. Both kingdoms faced threats from foreign powers and struggled with internal issues of corruption and social injustice. Isaiah's calling arises in this complex scenario, highlighting how the prophetic voice often rises in times of national crisis. Isaiah's ministry, which began with this dramatic calling, would last several decades and span the reigns of various kings of Judah. Throughout this period, Isaiah would face significant challenges, including resistance to his message and threats to his personal safety. However, he would remain faithful to his calling, demonstrating remarkable courage and determination. Isaiah's experience of calling raises important questions about vocation and purpose. How do we recognize our own calling in life? What kind of preparation is necessary to fulfill our mission? Isaiah's response, "Here I am," is a model of availability and obedience that has inspired many throughout the centuries. Isaiah's calling also illustrates the importance of authenticity in spiritual leadership. Before he could speak to others, Isaiah had to confront his own imperfection and experience divine grace. This process of self-examination and purification is crucial for anyone aspiring to a position of spiritual influence. Furthermore, Isaiah's calling demonstrates how personal experience with the divine can be transformative. The vision in the temple was not just a spectacular event, it was an encounter that redefined Isaiah's identity and purpose. He entered the temple as an ordinary man and left as a prophet of God. It is interesting to note how Isaiah's experience influenced his subsequent prophetic message. Themes such as the holiness of God, the need for purification, and the importance of obedience are recurring in his writings. His calling was not just an isolated event, but a foundational experience that shaped his entire perspective and ministry. Isaiah's calling also serves as a reminder of divine sovereignty in human history. At a moment of political and social uncertainty, God calls a man to be his voice. This suggests that even in times of apparent chaos, there is a divine purpose at work. For modern readers, The narrative of Isaiah's calling offers valuable insights into leadership, integrity, and moral courage. In a world that often seems to lack prophetic voices, Isaiah's story challenges us to consider our own responsibility to speak the truth and advocate for justice. Isaiah's vision in the temple also raises questions about the nature of religious experience. How do we balance respect for tradition with openness to new revelations? How do we discern between authentic experiences with the divine and illusions or manipulations? Finally, Isaiah's calling reminds us of the importance of humility and dependence on God. Even after his extraordinary experience, Isaiah remained aware of his limitations and the ongoing need for divine grace. This attitude of humility, combined with a deep conviction, characterized his entire prophetic ministry. As we reflect on Isaiah's calling, we are invited to consider our own spiritual journey. What kind of vision could inspire us to more dedicated service? How can we cultivate sensitivity to the divine voice in our own lives? Isaiah's example challenges us to be open to transformative encounters with the divine, and to respond with courage and obedience when we are called. The messianic revelations contained in the book of Isaiah are considered some of the most significant and detailed in the entire Old Testament. These prophecies have not only shaped the expectations of the Jewish people for centuries, but have also been the subject of intense study and debate among biblical scholars, theologians, and historians. One of the most well-known messianic prophecies of Isaiah is found in chapter 7, verse 14. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. This prophecy, known as the prophecy of the Virgin, has been interpreted by many Christians as a direct prediction of the birth of Jesus Christ. The name Emmanuel, which means God with us, is seen as a reference to the divine nature of the promised Messiah. It is important to note that this prophecy arose in a specific historical context. Isaiah pronounced it during the reign of King Ahaz of Judah, at a time when the kingdom was threatened by enemies. The prophecy, therefore, had an immediate significance for Isaiah's contemporaries, as well as a long-term significance that Christians later interpreted as fulfilled in Jesus. Another notable messianic prophecy is found in chapter 9, verses 6, 7. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and sustaining it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. This passage describes an ideal ruler whose qualities surpass those of an ordinary human king. The titles attributed to this ruler, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, are extraordinarily elevated. They suggest a leader who would combine wisdom, divine power, paternal care, and the ability to establish lasting peace. For many interpreters, these qualities point to a figure who is more than a mere human king, a divine Messiah. In chapter 11, Isaiah continues to develop the theme of the Messiah, describing him as a shoot that will come up from the stump of Jesse, the father of King David. This imagery evokes the idea of a new beginning, a rebirth of the Davidic lineage. The Messiah is portrayed as someone filled with the Spirit of the Lord, possessing wisdom, understanding, counsel, power, knowledge, and fear of the Lord. One of the most striking characteristics of this Messiah, according to Isaiah, is his ability to judge with justice and equity. He will not judge by appearances, nor make decisions based solely on what he hears, but will judge the needy with justice and make right decisions on behalf of the poor. This emphasis on social justice and protection of the vulnerable is a recurring theme in Isaiah's prophecies. Chapter 53 of Isaiah contains one of the most well-known and debated messianic prophecies. In it, Isaiah describes a suffering servant who bears the pains and transgressions of many. This figure is depicted as someone who was despised and rejected, familiar with suffering, and who, through his suffering, brings healing and redemption to others. The description of the suffering servant is remarkably detailed and moving. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Isaiah 53, 5. This passage has been interpreted by many Christians as a prediction of the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ. It is important to note that interpretations of these prophecies vary among different religious traditions. While Christians generally see these passages as direct references to Jesus Christ, Jews traditionally interpret them differently, often applying them to the people of Israel as a whole or to specific historical figures. Isaiah's messianic prophecies also include visions of an ideal future, often referred to as the Messianic Age. In chapter 2, for example, Isaiah describes a time when all nations will flow to Jerusalem to learn the ways of God. He envisions a time of universal peace, where nations will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. This vision of universal peace and harmony among nations has captured the imagination of people throughout the centuries. It presents an ideal of a transformed world where conflicts and wars are a thing of the past. For many, this vision serves as an inspiration and a call to work toward a more peaceful and just world. Another notable messianic prophecy is found in chapter 35, where Isaiah describes a radical transformation of nature. He speaks of deserts blooming, the blind regaining sight, the deaf hearing, and the lame leaping. This poetic language suggests a complete restoration, not only of humanity but of all creation. Isaiah's messianic prophecies are remarkable not only for their content, but also for their enduring influence. They have shaped messianic expectations in Judaism and played a crucial role in the formation of early Christian Christology. The authors of the New Testament frequently quote or allude to these prophecies, seeing them as fulfilled in Jesus Christ. For modern readers, Isaiah's messianic prophecies continue to be a source of reflection and inspiration. They raise important questions about hope, redemption, and the role of divine leadership in human history. Regardless of the specific interpretation, these prophecies present a powerful vision of a transformed future and an ideal leader who brings justice, peace, and healing. The messianic revelations of Isaiah also invite us to reflect on our own expectations and hopes for the future. What kind of leader and what kind of world do we long for? How can we work to realize, even partially, the vision of peace and justice that Isaiah describes? As we continue to explore Isaiah's prophecies, we see how they intertwine with themes of judgment and redemption, forming a complex and rich narrative about the relationship between God and humanity. This interconnection between different parts of the book of Isaiah naturally leads us to the next topic of our discussion: the messages of judgment and hope that permeate his prophecies. The prophecies of Isaiah present a striking duality between messages of judgment and promises of redemption. This tension between warning and hope is a central characteristic of the book, reflecting the complexity of the relationship between God and his people. Isaiah does not hesitate to denounce sin and announce the consequences of disobedience, but he also offers visions of a restored and glorious future. The theme of judgment is prominent in the early chapters of the book. Isaiah begins with a strong accusation against Judah and Jerusalem. "Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, a brood of evildoers, children who are corrupt. They have forsaken the Lord. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They have turned their back." Isaiah 1:4. This strong language sets the tone for many of the warnings that will follow. Isaiah criticizes a variety of sins, including idolatry, social injustice, political corruption, and religious hypocrisy. He condemns those who call evil good and good evil, Isaiah 5:20, highlighting the inversion of moral values in society. The prophet also denounces the oppression of the poor and vulnerable, a recurring concern in his messages. Isaiah's warnings are not limited to Judah and Israel alone. He also prophesies judgments against various neighboring nations, including Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, and others. These prophecies against the nations, found in chapters 13-23, demonstrate God's sovereignty over all peoples and serve as a reminder that no nation is beyond the reach of divine judgment. An important aspect of Isaiah's messages of judgment is their conditional nature. The prophet often presents judgment as a consequence of persistence in sin, but he also offers the possibility of repentance and restoration. For example, in chapter 1, after a series of accusations, God invites the people, "Come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow." Isaiah 1:18. This offer of forgiveness and purification is a recurring theme in the book, serving as a bridge between the messages of judgment and the promises of redemption. Isaiah constantly reminds his audience that God's ultimate purpose is not destruction, but restoration. The promises of redemption in Isaiah are some of the most beautiful and inspiring in the entire Bible. They encompass a wide range of themes, including national restoration, personal healing, spiritual transformation, and cosmic renewal. One of the most memorable promises is found in chapter 2, where Isaiah describes a future in which all nations will flow to Jerusalem to learn the ways of God. This vision of universal peace and harmony among the nations stands in stark contrast to the realities of conflict and division that Isaiah observed in his own time. Another powerful promise of redemption is found in chapter 35, where Isaiah paints a vivid picture of restoration. "The desert and the dry land shall be glad. The wilderness shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy." This poetic language suggests a complete transformation, not only of humanity, but of all creation. Isaiah's promises of redemption often intertwine with his messianic prophecies. The promised Messiah is portrayed as the agent of God's redemption, bringing justice, peace, and healing. In chapter 61, for example, the Messiah declares, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners." A remarkable aspect of Isaiah's promises of redemption is their cosmic dimension. The prophet's vision encompasses not only the restoration of Israel or even humanity, but all of creation. In chapter 65, Isaiah speaks of new heavens and a new earth, a vision of total renewal that would later be echoed in the book of Revelation. The tension between judgment and redemption in Isaiah's prophecies reflects a deep understanding of the nature of God and the divine-human relationship. God is portrayed as just and holy, unable to tolerate sin, but also as merciful and loving, always offering an opportunity for repentance and restoration. This duality in Isaiah's messages serves several purposes. First, it motivates repentance, showing the consequences of sin while also offering hope of forgiveness. Second, it maintains a healthy tension between the fear of God and trust in His mercy. Third, it provides comfort in times of affliction, assuring that judgment is not God's final word. For modern readers, the messages of judgment and redemption in Isaiah remain relevant. They challenge us to examine our own lives and societies in light of God's divine standards of justice and righteousness. At the same time, they offer hope that, no matter how bleak the situation may seem, there is always the possibility of redemption and renewal. Isaiah's prophecies also invite us to reflect on the nature of justice and mercy. How can we seek justice in our world without losing sight of the importance of forgiveness and reconciliation? How can we maintain hope in times of adversity, trusting in God's promises of redemption? Moreover, Isaiah's visions of a transformed future challenge us to work for justice and peace in our own time. While the full realization of these promises may be beyond our capacity, we can still strive to incorporate their principles into our lives and communities. As we continue our exploration of Isaiah's prophecies, we see how the themes of judgment and redemption intertwine with his other messages, including messianic prophecies and visions of the future. This interconnectedness naturally leads us to the next topic of our discussion, the enigmatic figure of the suffering servant, one of the most impactful and debated prophecies in the book of Isaiah. Among the many remarkable prophecies of Isaiah, the description of the suffering servant stands out as one of the most profound and impactful. This enigmatic figure, presented primarily in the so-called Songs of the Servant, found in Isaiah 42, 49, 50, and 52, 53, has been the subject of intense study and debate among biblical scholars, theologians, and historians over the centuries. The suffering servant is portrayed as someone chosen by God for a special mission. but whose life is marked by suffering and rejection. The most detailed and moving description of the servant is found in chapter 53, often referred to as the fourth song of the servant. This passage presents a powerful narrative of vicarious suffering and redemption. The chapter begins with a startling description of the servant. He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Isaiah 53:2. This image of a humble and unappealing figure sharply contrasts with traditional expectations of a powerful leader or a glorious Messiah. The narrative continues by describing how the servant was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. 53:3. The text emphasizes that the servant's suffering is not a result of his own sins, but rather that he bears the pains and transgressions of others. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. 53:4-5. One of the most notable aspects of this prophecy is the idea that the servant's suffering has a redemptive purpose. The text states that the punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. 53:5. This notion of vicarious suffering, where one person suffers for the benefit of others, is central to understanding the role of the servant. The prophecy also highlights the servant's attitude in the face of suffering. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. 53:7. This image of voluntary submission to suffering is deeply moving, and has been a source of reflection and inspiration for many throughout the centuries. The interpretation of this prophecy has been the subject of much debate. In the Christian tradition, the suffering servant is often identified with Jesus Christ. Many Christians see in this passage a detailed foreshadowing of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, particularly his sacrificial death on the cross. The authors of the New Testament frequently allude to this passage in their descriptions of Jesus. In the Jewish tradition, interpretations of the suffering servant have varied over time. Some interpretations view the servant as a collective figure, representing the entire people of Israel. Others have identified him with specific historical figures, such as Isaiah himself or other prophets. Still, others have interpreted him as a future messianic figure. Regardless of the specific interpretation, the prophecy of the suffering servant raises profound questions about the nature of suffering, the meaning of sacrifice, and the role of the individual in collective redemption. It challenges simplistic notions of reward and punishment, presenting a more complex view where suffering can have redemptive purposes. A particularly intriguing aspect of the prophecy is the transformation it describes. The servant, initially despised and rejected, is ultimately exalted. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong. 53:11-12. This dramatic reversal suggests that the path to true greatness may, paradoxically, pass through suffering and humiliation. For modern readers, the prophecy of the suffering servant continues to be a rich source of reflection. It invites us to reconsider our attitudes toward suffering and sacrifice. In a world that often values visible success and self-assertion, the figure of the servant reminds us that there is power in humility and in the willingness to suffer for the sake of others. The prophecy also raises important questions about justice and forgiveness. How can we reconcile the idea of a just God with the notion of vicarious suffering? How can the sacrifice of one bring healing to many? These are questions that continue to challenge and inspire religious and ethical thinkers. Furthermore, the figure of the suffering servant invites us to reflect on our own willingness to serve and sacrifice for the good of others. To what extent are we willing to embrace discomfort, rejection, or even suffering for a greater cause? How can we incorporate the spirit of selfless service into our own lives and communities? It is important to note that the prophecy of the suffering servant does not glorify suffering for its own sake. Instead, it presents a vision where suffering, when embraced voluntarily out of love for others, can have transformative and redemptive power. This is a message that resonates deeply in many spiritual and philosophical traditions around the world. The figure of the suffering servant also reminds us of the importance of looking beyond appearances. In a culture that often judges by the exterior, the prophecy challenges us to recognize the greatness that may be hidden in humility and selfless service. Finally, the prophecy of the suffering servant connects with the broader themes of the book of Isaiah. It intertwines with messages of judgment and redemption, offering a vision of how restoration can come through sacrifice. It also connects with messianic prophecies, presenting an image of leadership that sharply contrasts with conventional expectations of power and glory. As we continue our exploration of the prophecies of Isaiah, we see how the figure of the suffering servant adds a profound and moving dimension to the prophet's message. This vision of sacrificial service and redemption through suffering naturally leads us to the next topic of our discussion: the universal sovereignty of God proclaimed in the prophecies of Isaiah. A central and recurring theme in the prophecies of Isaiah is the affirmation of God's universal sovereignty. Throughout the book, Isaiah presents a vision of God that transcends national and ethnic boundaries, governing not only over Israel but over all nations and indeed over all creation. This emphasis on God's universal sovereignty is particularly remarkable, considering Isaiah's historical context. In a world where each nation had its own local deities, the assertion of a God who rules over all nations was a bold and revolutionary statement. Isaiah repeatedly proclaims that the God of Israel is, in fact, the God of the entire earth. One of the most powerful expressions of this universal sovereignty is found in chapter 40. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, or with the breadth of his hand marked off the heavens? Who has held the dust of the earth in a basket, or weighed the mountains on the scales and the hills in a balance? Isaiah 40:12. This poetic language portrays God as the creator and sustainer of the entire universe, not just of one nation or region. Isaiah also emphasizes God's sovereignty over human history. He presents God as the one who raises up and brings down nations, who even uses pagan empires as instruments of his purpose. In chapter 10, for example, God describes Assyria as the rod of my anger, 10:5, an instrument of judgment against Israel. However, Isaiah also warns that Assyria, in turn, will face judgment for its own arrogance and cruelty. This view of divine sovereignty over the nations is particularly evident in the so-called Oracles Against the Nations, chapters 13-23. In these chapters, Isaiah prophesies judgments against various neighboring nations, including Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, and others. These prophecies serve to demonstrate that no nation is beyond the reach of God's governance. An intriguing aspect of God's sovereignty in Isaiah's prophecies is the way it relates to human freedom. While God is presented as sovereign over all events, Isaiah also emphasizes human responsibility. Nations and individuals are called to repentance and obedience, suggesting that their choices have real consequences within God's sovereign plan. God's sovereignty in Isaiah's prophecies is not merely a matter of power, but also of purpose. Isaiah presents a vision of God working through history to accomplish his redemptive plans. In chapter 45, God declares, "I form the light and create darkness. I bring prosperity and create disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things." 45:7. This statement suggests that even seemingly negative events are part of God's greater plan. A particularly notable aspect of God's sovereignty in Isaiah is the way it extends into the future. Isaiah often presents God as the one who declares the end from the beginning, 46:10. This ability to foresee and shape the future is presented as proof of true divinity, in contrast to idols that cannot foresee or influence future events. God's universal sovereignty in Isaiah also has implications for the understanding of salvation. While Isaiah often focuses on Israel as God's chosen people, he also presents a vision of salvation that extends to all nations. In chapter 2, for example, he describes a future where many peoples will come to the mountain of the Lord to learn his ways. This universalist vision reaches its peak in chapter 56, where God declares, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." 56:7. This statement suggests that God's ultimate plan is to include people from all nations in his kingdom. For modern readers, Isaiah's emphasis on God's universal sovereignty offers several important lessons. First, it reminds us that no aspect of our lives or the world is outside of God's control. This can be a source of comfort in times of uncertainty or crisis. Second, Isaiah's vision challenges any tendency toward narrow nationalism or religious exclusivism. If God is sovereign over all nations, then all people, regardless of their ethnic or national origin, are equally objects of His care and potential recipients of His grace. Third, God's sovereignty in Isaiah's prophecies encourages us to view global events from a broader perspective. Even when circumstances seem chaotic or unjust, we can trust that God is working to accomplish His greater purposes. Isaiah's vision also raises challenging questions. How do we reconcile God's sovereignty with the evident evil and suffering in the world? How do we balance the affirmation of divine sovereignty with the recognition of human responsibility? These are questions that theologians and philosophers have debated for centuries, and Isaiah's prophecies continue to be a rich source for such reflection. Moreover, God's universal sovereignty in Isaiah's prophecies has implications for our understanding of justice and ethics. If God is sovereign over all nations, then all nations are accountable to His standards of justice. This challenges us to think globally about issues of social justice, human rights, and care for creation. Finally, Isaiah's vision of God's sovereignty invites us to a more humble perspective on our place in the universe. Recognizing God's greatness and power can help us maintain our own struggles and achievements in perspective, inspiring us to trust more fully in God and seek His will in our lives. As we continue our exploration of Isaiah's prophecies, we see how the affirmation of God's universal sovereignty intertwines with the other main themes of the book, including judgment, redemption, and the messianic promise. This comprehensive vision of God's governance over all creation naturally leads us to our final topic, Isaiah's vision of a new creation, where God's sovereignty is fully manifested in a renewed and transformed world. The prophecies of Isaiah culminate in a grand and inspiring vision of a new creation, where God's sovereignty is fully manifested and all of creation is transformed and renewed. This vision of a glorious future serves as a climax for many of the themes that permeate the book, offering hope and comfort amidst messages of judgment and challenge. The vision of the new creation in Isaiah is most explicitly expressed in the final chapters of the book, particularly in chapters 65 and 66. In chapter 65, verse 17, God declares, "Behold, I am creating new heavens and a new earth. The former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind." This powerful declaration suggests a radical and complete transformation of reality as we know it. It is important to note that the idea of new heavens and a new earth does not necessarily imply the total destruction of the current world, but rather its renewal and transformation. Isaiah's vision is of a world where the effects of sin and the curse are finally and completely reversed. The description that Isaiah provides of this new creation is rich in vivid and poetic imagery. He speaks of a place where the voice of weeping and the cry of distress will no longer be heard, 65:19. He describes extraordinary longevity where the one who dies at 100 will be considered a youth, 65:20. There are images of prosperity and security where people will build houses and dwell in them, and will plant vineyards and eat their fruit, 65:21. One of the most memorable images of the new creation in Isaiah is the transformation of nature. In chapter 11, the prophet speaks of a time when the wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf, the lion, and the fattened calf will graze together, and a child will lead them, 11:6. This vision of harmony in nature, where predators and prey coexist peacefully, symbolizes the complete restoration of the original order of creation. The new creation in Isaiah is not only a physical transformation, but also a moral and spiritual one. The prophet speaks of a time when the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea, 11:9. This image suggests a transformation of human consciousness, where the knowledge and worship of God will be universal. An important aspect of the vision of the new creation in Isaiah is its social and political dimension. The prophet speaks of a just ruler who will judge with justice for the needy and will make decisions for the poor of the earth. 11:4. This vision of perfect justice and righteous government stands in stark contrast to the realities of oppression and injustice that Isaiah frequently denounces in his own time. The new creation in Isaiah also has a cosmic dimension. In chapter 60, the prophet speaks of a time when the sun will no longer be your light by day, nor will the brightness of the moon illuminate you. For the Lord will be your everlasting light. 60:19. This image suggests a radical transformation not only of the earth but of the entire cosmos. It is important to note that, although the vision of the new creation is often associated with a distant future or the end of times, Isaiah presents it as something that is already beginning to manifest. In chapter 43, God declares, "Behold, I am doing a new thing. It is already springing forth. Do you not perceive it?" 43:19. This suggests that the new creation is not merely a future hope, but a reality that is already unfolding in the present. For modern readers, the vision of the new creation in Isaiah offers several important lessons. First, it gives us hope amidst the difficulties and challenges of the present. The promise of a future where every tear will be wiped away and every injustice will be corrected can be a source of comfort and strength. Second, the vision of the new creation challenges us to live according to the values of that future kingdom in the present. If we are destined for a world of peace, justice, and harmony, how can we begin to incorporate those values into our lives and communities now? Third, Isaiah's vision reminds us of the interconnectedness of all creation. The transformation he describes is not limited to human beings, but encompasses all of nature. This can inspire us to a greater ecological awareness and a deeper sense of stewardship of creation. The vision of the new creation in Isaiah also raises important questions for reflection. How do we balance hope for a transformed future with the responsibility to act in the present? How does the promise of a new creation shape our understanding of the purpose and meaning of history? Moreover, Isaiah's vision invites us to expand our imagination about what is possible. In a world often characterized by cynicism and hopelessness, the boldness of Isaiah's vision challenges us to dream big and believe in the possibility of radical transformation. Finally, the vision of the new creation in Isaiah reminds us that history has a purpose and direction. We are not trapped in an endless cycle of repetition, but are moving towards a glorious destiny. This perspective can give us a deeper sense of meaning and purpose in our daily lives. The prophecies of Isaiah form a richly woven tapestry of visions, warnings, and promises that continue to captivate and challenge readers to this day. From Isaiah's dramatic call in the temple to his visions of a new creation, the book takes us on a journey through the highs and lows of Israel's history, always pointing towards a future of hope and redemption. The themes we explored: the prophetic call, the messianic revelations, the messages of judgment and redemption, the figure of the suffering servant, the universal sovereignty of God, and the vision of the new creation, intertwined to form a powerful narrative about the relationship between God and humanity. Isaiah presents to us a God who is both transcendent in his holiness and intimately involved in human affairs, a God who judges sin, yet always offers hope for restoration. The prophecies of Isaiah invite us to look beyond our immediate circumstances and glimpse God's greater plan for history. They challenge us to live with integrity, to seek justice, and to trust in God's promises, even in times of adversity. Above all, they inspire us with a vision of a future where all creation will be renewed and the glory of God will be fully manifested. May the words of this ancient prophet continue to echo in our hearts, challenging us to live with hope and purpose as we await the full realization of his glorious visions.